I don't want to deal with the people that have no conscience. If I'm going to be with people, I want to be with people.
Nobody builds a legend without leaving a few bodies behind, and Teutul Senior has left plenty. For more than a decade, Orange County Choppers wasn't just a motorcycle shop on the Discovery Channel. It was a battlefield dressed up in chrome and custom paint, and Paul Senior ruled it the way generals rule wars, loudly, without apology, and with zero tolerance for disloyalty. He turned a passion for custom motorcycles into a national television sensation, dragged his family through every ugly moment along the way, and built a name that millions of American chopper fans recognized on sight. People loved him for it. A surprising number, including his own blood, eventually chose to walk away anyway. Behind every shouting match that made it to air, behind every theme bike reveal and deadline meltdown, there were people carrying a quiet resentment that never fully showed up on camera. People who gave Paul Senior everything they had and still ended up on the wrong side of his trust. Some left on their own terms, some were pushed out, some took things to court. What all of them share is that Paul Senior made it abundantly clear over years of interviews that these 5 people disappointed him in ways that cut deep, not just as a boss, but as someone who genuinely believed he was building something that would outlast the cameras. The 5 on this list were talented, trusted, and in several cases treated like family inside the walls of Orange County Choppers. That's what makes their stories so much more complicated than a simple firing or a dramatic walkout. Personal wounds heal differently than professional ones, and Paul Senior's wounds from these 5 never quite closed. Starting at number 5, Cody Connelly arrived at Orange County Choppers as a teenager and left a legacy nobody expected to end the way it did. In the early seasons of American Chopper, Cody stood out precisely because he never tried to. No yelling, no angling for camera time, no ego flaring up in the middle of a build. A teenager learning to fabricate custom motorcycles in a shop full of grown men who argued constantly, he kept his head down and let the work do the talking. Paul Senior noticed immediately. Cody started working at OCC while still in high school, absorbing everything he could about custom bike building, and Paul Senior treated him with a gruff affection he didn't extend to everyone. Then came the graduation moment, the on-camera reveal where the OCC crew presented Cody with a custom chopper as a gift for finishing high school. Paul Senior beamed with something that looked like fatherly pride. Fans ate every second of it. But according to Cody himself, what aired and what actually happened existed in 2 separate realities, because he later claimed the bike was never handed over to him. Despite the emotional buildup, ownership never transferred. OCC allegedly continued using the bike and Cody's image for promotional purposes long after he had left the company. In 2009, Cody filed a lawsuit against Paul Senior and Orange County Choppers, alleging misappropriation of likeness, breach of contract, and fraud. Paul Senior absorbed it as a betrayal of the deepest kind. He had brought Cody in young, handed him skills that took others years to acquire, given him a national platform, and in return received court documents. When Paul addressed it publicly, the language stayed measured, but the temperature behind it was icy. He called it disappointing and implied Cody lacked gratitude, but the real message ran rawer than the surface suggested. The lawsuit settled out of court with undisclosed terms, and the relationship closed permanently. No reunion specials, no casual visits, just silence, and in a shop that had always operated like a family, that silence carried weight words couldn't match. Cody didn't disappear into obscurity after leaving OCC. He linked up with Vinnie DiMartino, another former Orange County Choppers builder, and together they launched V-Force Customs. Fans were thrilled. But from Paul Senior's position, watching 2 of his most trusted people build something together outside his control felt like a wound that kept reopening. Which leads directly to number 4, because Vinnie DiMartino was the foundation that kept Orange County Choppers standing during the years when everything else threatened to collapse. The master fabricator who could take the vaguest sketch and turn it into a motorcycle worthy of a magazine cover, Vinnie stayed in the background and kept the entire operation moving while Paul Jr. clashed with his father over essentially everything. Paul Senior relied on him more than he probably ever admitted. And that's exactly what made Vinnie's departure in 2007 so jarring. No explosion preceded it, no dramatic final scene, no screaming match. Vinnie simply decided he was finished and walked away on his own terms. For a show that had conditioned viewers to expect confrontations at every turn, a quiet resignation unsettled people in ways a blowout never could. Because it said something no argument manages to say. It said Vinnie had stopped believing in the place enough to stay. The deeper wound came later when Vinnie appeared alongside Paul Jr. during the Senior versus Junior spin-off era, lending his expertise to the son Paul Senior had a near-total falling out with. In Paul's world, where loyalty runs in straight binary lines with no room for gray, that move sealed the verdict permanently. Number 3 never built a single motorcycle at Orange County Choppers, and that was eventually the whole problem. Mikey Teutul, the youngest of the Teutul family, filled a role nobody formally defined because nobody needed to in the early seasons. He was the comic relief, the show's human pressure valve, the guy who wandered in during the worst moments and said something absurd enough to drop the temperature just far enough for everyone to breathe. Fans loved Mikey because he wasn't performing anything. He was just himself, and in a show built around manufactured conflict, that authenticity was genuinely rare. But as Orange County Choppers grew into a serious commercial operation, the question of what Mikey actually contributed became harder to set aside. He didn't build bikes, didn't manage operations, didn't design. Behind the scenes, Mikey's personal struggles with addiction had grown serious enough that they couldn't be waved away with a laugh. Paul Senior, far more comfortable with confrontation than vulnerability, found himself in genuinely foreign territory. Mikey went to rehab, and when he returned, the dynamic had shifted underneath everyone. When the great Teutul family fracture finally arrived, Mikey aligned himself with Paul Jr., and Paul Senior responded the only way he knew how. He shut the door, barring Mikey from the Orange County Choppers building entirely. Mikey eventually stepped away and built a quieter life centered around art, which suited him far better than the chaos ever had. Number 2 belongs to Rick Petko, and if any story on this list deserves to be called a quiet tragedy, it belongs to him. A welder and fabricator with the kind of precision that made everyone around him look sharper by association, Rick joined the OCC crew slightly later than some of the originals, but earned his place quickly and without fanfare. While the cameras chased family drama, Rick worked in the background, producing custom motorcycles so clean they looked less like garage builds and more like gallery pieces. Over time, the wear showed in ways that had nothing to do with hours and everything to do with the environment. The tired look that settled into his eyes somewhere around the middle seasons, the long exhales after another difficult day in a shop that had long since stopped being primarily about motorcycle building and become primarily about being a reality television show. In 2013, he made the quiet decision to leave, with no lawsuits, no scorched earth, no parting shots to the press. Just a clean exit from a man who had given a great deal and decided it was finally enough. Paul Senior took it personally regardless, not because Rick had failed or betrayed anyone, but because in Paul's philosophy, good people who respect the shop don't walk away unless something is fundamentally broken. Rick never said a negative word about OCC publicly and spoke generously about what the experience had given him. None of that changed the quiet accusation embedded in a dignified exit. Paul Senior found the silence more difficult to argue against than any shouting match, because you can respond to anger, but there is no good response to a man who simply decides he's had enough and means it completely. And that brings everything to number 1, where the list takes a turn that still surprises people, because the person at the top never worked as a builder at Orange County Choppers at all. Joe Puliafico was the show's editor, the man who decided what Discovery Channel audiences would actually see, which moments would get amplified, which tensions would breathe, and which realities would quietly disappear. In reality television, that editorial power is enormous, bigger in practical terms than almost anything that happens in front of a camera, because the editor doesn't just show viewers what occurred. The editor decides what it meant. According to Paul Senior, Joe sometimes told the wrong story, recontextualizing moments in ways that pushed him closer to cartoon villain than complicated human being. In a business built entirely on his name and reputation, that narrative control felt like a violation he had no way of protecting. Insiders suggested Joe wasn't always a passive observer either. Situations were reportedly nudged toward escalation, arguments allowed to go further than they might have naturally, and the mechanics of reality television worked against the interests of a family trying to run an actual business. What puts Joe Puliafico at the top of this list is what he represents that the other four don't. Every other person here disappointed Paul Sr. within a relationship Paul had chosen and built himself. Cody was his apprentice. Vinnie was his right hand. Mikey was his son. Rick was his trusted craftsman. But Joe was a reminder that Paul Sr. was never fully in control of his own story, that the version of himself the world saw passed through someone else's choices before it ever reached an audience. Someone whose loyalty ran to ratings and not to the man whose name sat above the door. For someone as fundamentally committed to control as Paul Teutul Senior, that realization may have stung more than any lawsuit, any quiet resignation, or any family rebellion. Not because Joe was the worst person to work around him, but because Joe proved that in reality television, the most powerful person in the room is rarely the loudest one.